Here we go. Okay, I guess we'll get started after that technological delay. Of course, it's inevitable. Good afternoon. Tbilisi time. This show or this webinar is coming out of Tbilisi, Georgia. My name is Barrett. I am the former director of Jumpstart Georgia, and now I work in data journalism with media organizations based largely locally in the Caucasus and in the former Soviet space. Today's talk is going to be about using data in stories without misleading your audience. I hope to make this as interesting as possible, given this is my first webinar, and also given the fact that I had no feedback from the audience. So I feel like I'm talking to my laptop. But I hope this will be prove useful to some people, and I'm happy to take questions both during the webinar and after, as well as after. You can email me. My email is on the last slide of this slideshow. All right, let's get going. So, using data in stories without misleading your audience. What does that mean? Well, I guess this webinar is basically coming at from the perspective, I guess, of data visualization, but not only, right? It's a hot topic. It's been a hot topic for many years now. It seems to be very widespread, but how people and organizations use it is not. I think, so for some, it's a mystery. People are interested in getting involved and wanting to know how this is done or what to do. And for those that do it, perhaps, there might be some areas in which, I don't know, there could be some improvement. I'll do my best to speak humbly on this issue, since there's so many great people out there working in data visualization and data communication. So I'm going to talk mostly about data communication as a broad topic. Of course, data visualization is one component of data communication. So I guess the first thing that's important to know, or I guess to really set the stage for when you want to do data visualization of data, you have data you want to communicate to your audience, is really not to forget that this is about communication. So first and foremost, it's important to remember, if you're a journalist, your journalistic training, this is about communicating, and if you're in, I guess, an NGO or an activist or an activist organization, then you're primarily dealing with advocacy, and again, it comes down to communication. So what is the most important thing? Well, let's put the tech aside, let's put the cool visuals aside, and let's talk about the bare bones issues. Who is your audience? What goals do you want to achieve when you're communicating to your audience? What is your message? How should you craft your message, knowing your audience and also having clear and achievable goals with that audience? And then what is the best medium to deliver that message, and what are the best channels to deliver that formatted message to your audience in order to achieve your goals? And so I guess stepping back and looking at each of these bullet points, you wrap it up all together into the last part, which is like, what channels do you need to use to reach your audience? and what format of how should you format your message in order for your audience to actually want to read what you have to say, um, and what and is the way that you packaged your message going to achieve the goals that you set out from the beginning. So that could be, and that's a very general approach, but I think it's always good to not get lost in the weeds when you're dealing with a data in a story. So I think that is crucial. Everything else are the sort of mechanics of how you want to do it. Though, data and data visualization seem very new. This has been going on for a long time, in so far as like computer-assisted reporting and many other in other environments as well. So, using data in reporting and in stories and in advocacy campaigns, this is not new, but I think it's just become very hot and being very blatant. Hey, check out this data. That's actually probably more new than communicating information that is derived from data. So, a lot of people ask me. Uh, oh, and just so everyone knows, this webinar will probably be over about at 2:50 p.m. Tbilisi time, so that'll be around in about 30 minutes. Feel free to drop a question uh, or reach out if you are interested in clarifying or having me clarify something. So. Uh, well, one thing, when I work with journalists or NGOs they're interested in this thing called data visualization, or they have data they want to communicate to audience. And one thing I stress often is that somebody in that process, whether if you're the sole person that is in charge of reporting or doing a story, or if you're part of a team and an organization that is responsible for that, is somebody needs to have a grounding in statistics. And that doesn't mean that you have to be, superfly statistics person. Um, but you have to have a basic grounding of statistics. And why? Because statistics is the language we use to work with data and to understand data. It's the principles of statistics and the concepts of statistics, the ideas involved in statistics those are the ideas that we use to approach a data set from the beginning. So, before we even get to data visualization, we need to understand what the data says. What is this data by itself? Is meaningless. So we need to apply some methods and understand what's going on. But not only, it may be that you receive a report where somebody has already done that work. And as a journalist or an activist, you want to use that report to strengthen your campaign or strengthen your arguments or add an opposing argument in a story or whatever the case may be. Having a grounding in statistics is going to take you a long way into understanding the value of that research, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of that research. And I think that's really, really invaluable when it comes to using data in reporting, using data in, and communicating that data to an audience in a visual way. Before you even get there, you have to make sure that the data that visualization or that reporting is founded on is sound. And if it's not, well, what do you do? Well, you can't use it. You can't base conclusions off of really sketchy data and expect to be taken seriously. And if you write in an article, if you want the rug to be pulled out from under your feet, yeah, by all means, use a shady use a research with a shady research design. But if your goal is to inform and to clarify some issue, then of course you need to be able to look critically at that research and that data and understand what's going on. Um, so be logical and critical. Does the data make sense? Do the research questions make sense? Does it hold water? Is it actually responding to the issue, or is it some sort of, uh, you know, you know, it sounds like it's about the issue, but it's really not. Be curious. You have to be curious when you're looking at the research and when you're looking at data. Whether you're doing first time sort of research, that you get your hands on a financial data set and you're sifting through it, you're sorting it, you're looking at the range of values for one attribute, and you have to be curious because you have to be willing to put in the time to play with that data and to ask questions, whether it be the raw data or the research that you're looking at for your story. And I think that's quite important. Uh, and in the end, I know this is a mantra that just resounds in the statistical world, but correlation does not mean causation. So just because there's a strong correlation in the data for two different things, whatever they are, it doesn't mean that necessarily that one thing causes the other. As a reporter or as an activist, you need to be careful to not jump to conclusions and not jump to the idea that, oh, because there's a strong correlation between these two variables, that means that one variable is actually causing the other variable. That would be a mistake. And I think that oftentimes when journalists or NGOs or advocacy organizations are trying to simplify the data for their audience, it often comes across as like the implication is that one thing always causes the other. And I think sometimes in some cases you can feel quite strong that the evidence supports that, but in other cases you need to be quite careful. So I'm not saying always don't do that, but like I've seen a lot of sort of like conclusions that have been rushed to, or just simply like, yeah, this information was communicated with a strong leaning towards this A caused B when you really can't make that. And when in doubt, and even if you have a strong like statistical background or some statistical grounding, don't be afraid to reach out to somebody who has a much better grounding and say, hey, can I say this? And oftentimes they'll be happy to help you. It's good to get that out of the way, and then to imply things that aren't necessarily true, because I think that takes us into into a future section, which is don't misrepresent the data, right? If the data is saying one thing, don't try to force it into a narrative that you had already preconceived. That doesn't do anyone any good and doesn't do the data any good, and it really undermines the goals and the story, and really kind of you know you belittle your audience when you try to do that. You're being manipulative in many cases. You don't want to do that. You want to inform. You want to clarify. You want to engender discourse, but you don't want to do that in a way where the ends don't justify the means in this case. Um, but you going on to the next topic is you really have to have something to say. And so that comes back to the grounding in statistics and understanding some basic principles with data, and so you don't just rush to the visualization. The visualization is a result of having something to say. Though not only there's a sort of back and forth relationship. When you're looking at data, you need to kind of visualize it to understand what's going on in the data. We're only human, we're not computers, and the visuals really help us understand the distributions and the patterns in the data, the outliers, if there are any, things like that. And so, but at the same time, those things, those helpers, are not necessarily the thing. Those shouldn't be the final thing that we communicate to the audience, because those are just helping us a lot of work has to go into transferring those visuals into the story that your audience is going to receive or going to read. So ask yourself the question, before you jump into the visualization, is the idea, is what you are saying useful, or does it add value to the current discourse on that topic? You know, um, having, throwing a data table into an article is not necessarily doing that. I mean, there might be some value in just sharing the data offhand, and that, okay, that's fine. That in and of itself is not a story, right? So, what is it? What is the data? What is important? And so when we talk about that, we talk about the relationships that you're trying to communicate. Did you find a relationship that actually is quite interesting? And what do we mean by that? A relationship of between what? Between we're talking about data, so relationships between variables, right? Are there relationships between variables that suggest something very interesting that you think is worth exploring, but also reporting on and communicating to an audience? If that's the case, great. That is the sort of bread and butter of what we're trying to what you're trying to do as a data journalist, what you're trying to do even as a data scientist, I guess, is like find relationships that are interesting, that sort of raise flag and say, this is interesting. It could be a negative thing or it could be a positive thing. That's not important. What matters is that it's interesting. So a lot of time and energy goes into comparing variables, and depending on what data you have, you have to be curious and you have to explore the relationships between all different kinds of variables to see, is something interesting happening. But when you find that thing, that's where you're like, the light bulb goes off and you're like, wow, I think we have a story here. I think we need to communicate this. And then that's kind of what you do. You see a lot of data visualizations that are just kind of like like somebody vomited data and colors and graphs onto a canvas, and quite, sometimes they're very pretty, and sometimes there can be value in that, but more often than not, it's not very deliberate in terms of communicating a specific idea, which basically is underscored by a relationship between different variables in the data set that you think, wow, this has social value, or this has value to my audience, whatever it is. So, like really I would focus on that. And then comes into play, the context of that thing. Yeah, you found this relationship, but a relationship isn't necessarily of value to an audience unless the audience knows what the context is, right? Why is this relationship so interesting? That's where you kind of have to put your reporter hat on, and then go, what are the answers to the who, what, where, why, when, how, etc. You know the graphic, the visual, or the data, they have those things that you need to. That's the environment, the ecosystem in which you're presenting this data, whether it be a visual or whether it be long form reporting, whatever it is. You have to contextualize that data in a way that really somebody coming into it, your audience, can make sense of it, can understand the context of why is the relationship you think so interesting, and why should they care about it? And by providing that, you really give context, and so that people can sink their teeth into the story. And I think that there's a lot of value in that. Um, so once you have this, so moving on to the next kind of chapter in this short webinar, once you have this idea, this relationship, and this context, and you're ready to sort of map out how you want to communicate it to your audience, it's very important that you sit down and you say, I don't want to lose the integrity of what the data is saying. I want what I communicate to be true to what the data was actually saying. I don't want to misrepresent the data. I don't want to exaggerate the data. I don't want to manipulate my audience with a preconceived narrative and force the data into that narrative when it, the data doesn't necessarily support that, or it's a huge stretch, right? There's a lot of common sense that goes into this, and I think I think if you're somebody who's doing this, when you're pushing the envelope. It's when that's too far, or when that's too much. It's when you say, for example, like, well, the in statistics there's several kinds of averages, right? There's the average, which is the sum, or it's the sum of all the items divided by the number of those items, which is called the mean. Then you have the median, which is basically you take all the items and you sort them from greatest to least to greatest, and then you find the middle item and you say, okay, that's the average. And then you have the mode, which we won't really talk about here. So when you have your data and you're saying, like, for example, like, I'm at a bar and I'm having some beers, and my friends and we all work at the local cafe, and we just got off and we're having a beer, and we're talking about our salaries, and we say collectively, our salary, gosh, our salary is, the five of us, and we're saying, like, gosh, our average salary is, you know annual salary is $20,000 a year, which is probably pretty high if you work at a cafe. But and in walks Bill Gates, and he comes down, orders a beer, and sits down next to you. And though it's an odd coupling, you guys hit it off, and then eventually you come back to your original conversation and says, "What is our average salary?" Well, if you look at your average salary, then you say, "Well, our average salary is somewhere in the millions of dollars." Or maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And everyone's looking around saying, the average is $100 million? I don't think so. And everyone's like, but that is the average. If you add up everyone's salary and you divide it by six, including Bill Gates, then you're going to get a very high number. And what that means is that, means are very susceptible to being influenced by outliers. And so is that mean, when you're talking about an average, the best average to use? In this case, no. Of course not, because Bill Gates is an outlier, and we don't want to overly weight, like Bill Gates. We don't want to overrepresent Bill Gates when he's only one person and the rest are five, or making like $20,000 a year. So, maybe the next, let's take a look at the median. If we take all the salaries, order them from least to greatest, and take the middle one, we're going to have somewhere around $20,000 a year. Is that more representative than of the average annual salary? Yes, it is. And so, that's just basically using some common sense and being fair to what the data is saying. So that's just an example of what we mean by don't misrepresent the data. Stephen Few, who's I'm a great admirer of, I used his books, and I used his books in teaching a lot in preparation for trainings. He says, maintain the visual correspondence with the data. The visual has to correspond with what the data is saying. Is basically what that means, and it's very important that we do that. But there are also a number of ways that that doesn't happen. When we have a graph, a visual, we can look at what are the intervals like between the tick marks, the values on one axis, the x-axis or the y-axis. Are we looking at logarithmic scale but we're not really labeling it as logarithmic, and therefore we're trying to show a pattern that's not necessarily true to the data, or trying to manipulate our audience in that way. That's not a very that's not being fair to the data. It's also not being fair to your audience. Using zero-based scales, There's a lot of debate on when you can and can't, but for the most part, the rule of thumb is use zero-based scales. Why is that? Well, take a look at the next slide here, where we're looking at, let's say this is two graphs uh, based off Facebook company valuation over time. So this is from December 2010 to August 2011. And if we take a look at the first graph on top, we have a zero-based scale. So you look at the y-axis, it starts at 0 and goes all the way up to 90 in billions. But if we take a look at the bottom one, they get rid of all the space underneath the chart that's not being used, the line, and it starts at 55 and goes to 90. And the difference between the two is actually quite significant because visually, the one on the bottom, the one that doesn't start at 0, looks like there's a much larger change over time. And so that's the visual takeaway. So our perception is that the change in company valuation between those dates was a lot more significant than it probably was, simply because the visual perception of that, the result of not using a zero base. When in fact, if we use the zero, we can see that the rise of the valuation, the slope of the line, is a lot more shallow, and therefore like really kind of gives it, it's a little bit more steady. It's not as dramatic. We're talking about billions of dollars. Of course, it's dramatic, but it's not visually as dramatic, and it's more, I think, faithful to what the data says than the bottom graph. You need to be careful when you're looking at a chart, when you're looking at a graph, and when you're creating a graph, that you're not removing the zero base just to create a more impactful image to make the data look more exciting than it really is. That's misrepresentation. Use the correct. Well, here I have I guess a few other examples of images, but I go through the rest of the bullet points for this section. Use the correct visual components to communicate relationships. When we're doing data visualizations, we have basically like only a few things to work with. From when we talk about visual components, we have dots, lines, and shapes, and then we have textures and colors too, and we combine these things using design principles, what we call Gestalt principles, to communicate relationships between variables in the data. And so if we take the well-used bar chart, which is my favorite chart, because it's so simple yet it's so powerful and it's so true to the data most of the time, we can see that that bar chart wasn't always popular. People weren't always using a bar chart, and so we kind of take for granted that there's this amazing thing. But somebody sat down and used some design principles to say that if we take a line and use its length to communicate the magnitude of one category, and we put it next to another category, and the length of that category, the magnitude of that category is measured using a line, it's very easy to compare and see which one is taller than the other one. Therefore, let's put them next to each other, and we've got a great way to visualize the magnitudes of categories and compare them like that. But that wasn't always, there wasn't always a bar chart, but somebody had to think of that. All this, so we're not just talking about bar charts here, though. We're talking about any visualization you can think of. And today people are coming up with newer and different visualizations to communicate different relationships between different variables. And some of them really work, and the new ones, and they're all founded in strong design principles, Gestalt principles, using these dots, lines, shapes, colors, and textures. So having a grounding in that is really important. And lastly, I think, make charts self-contained. I tack that on there because I often see that charts are often, they don't have titles, and they don't have explanatory information. So when people share them on social media, which is so popular today, you know, you kind of have to explain it. You have to write a bunch of text to explain the chart, and you shouldn't have to do that. A good way of communicating data means that, you know, people should be able to read it and understand completely what the context and the scope of the message you're trying to communicate. So make charts self-contained. Put everything into the chart that needs to be there. Um, so going back to misrepresenting or choosing, also another way of not saying it as a negative, misrepresenting, but choose the best vehicle for your message. Let's take a look at the pie chart. You know, very common visual chart, but it has its downsides. Yes, it's very common, so people can read it very quickly. But what does it really do? You know, taking a look at this example, you know, we see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different categories. Can we see, you know, is Western Europe and India, like, how much bigger is India from Western Europe? I don't know. It's very hard to tell. And so, you know, if your goal is to compare the magnitudes between different categories, then maybe the pie chart is not your best tool, but using a bar chart would be better. If your goal is to just show, you know, which are the biggest pieces of the pie, well, I think then that is the best use of a pie chart. And so maybe that works. But then there are some obvious limitations, right? If you're saying, you know, 33% of, I don't even know what this pie chart is about, but like, if you say like India has, if this is population or for whatever reason or whatever, you know, it's a, you know, India has 33% of the total world population. Well, what does that mean? What is the total, right? So you need to put the total value of what is the total in absolute terms in the pie chart, so that people can say, well, 33% of, let's say, what, 8 billion or whatever. You know, so that's really important. You know, so then people can actually understand, and that also helps you avoid the cases where people do try to manipulate their audience, which is, and it's not always intentional, but you know, you might have 10 people in a room and you say 50% or 70% of this group is female, and you're like 70%. Well, there's only 10 people in the room. Like, okay, so that means 7 people. You know, 7 people, depending on the context, might not be aligned, and it might not really make it so that your message is, you know, it's founded on strong numbers, strong data. So don't, you know, don't say, you know, 1 out of 3 scientists believe that this type of toothpaste is better for you, when there are only 3 scientists. You know, or say 2 out of 3 scientists believe this is the best approach, when there are only, you know, 3 scientists. That's meaningless. So that's important to watch out for. And then here we have, you know, just avoid 3D when you can, because it just, there's no way, like if you take a look at this, this is absurd, but it is actually what we see often in books. It's this fun Excel 3D charts that people like to put into their annual reports, etc. And it just doesn't communicate anything here. Like when you look at this, you don't even know like what is bigger than what is taller than what. How can I compare one thing to the next? It's not helpful. Break it down into several 2-dimensional charts if necessary to make it easier, excuse me, for your audience to consume that information. Just avoid 3D charts when possible. That's my advice. Very rarely will 3 dimensions in a graph or chart assist in clarifying information about a topic. Um, and this is just a kind of gestalt breakdown that I like to show, where the word itself is broken down into the principles that we use for data visualization, but not only in all sort of graphic design or design principle work. So says, 1 second, I'll see if I can move myself from the charts, and I apologize about that. I didn't mean to be so prominent. All right, I hope that helps, and I apologize about that. I hope you can see the slides a little bit better. Stephen Few recommends a few basic things when you are communicating data, and specifically visually, and that's to introduce the issue or topic or the idea, explain it, reinforce it, highlight it, sequence, because order matters, recommend specific things, meaning, highlight the things that are going to be, that you want your audience to focus in on. You don't want your audience to be like, okay, here's a visualization. It's so messy. Like, I don't even know where to begin. I don't know what the point is of this. So how do you recommend that? How do you highlight? How do you highlight the point so that you're doing a lot of the legwork for your audience, and they can see what is interesting about the data, and make it easy for your audience to inquire more or ask more questions about the data than just what you thought was interesting. You often see that in interactive visualizations where maybe the default visualization is designed to communicate a specific idea, but then the visual allows the audience to play with it and to explore different things. And that could be of great value. It's very engaging for the audience, and there's a lot of value in that. But going back, like when we talk about introduce, explain, reinforce, highlight, or sequence, recommend, inquire, what that comes down to is I think about this as really as like annotating your charts. Really, it makes sense. This is a visual. I hope you can see it. Let me see. Yeah, okay. So this is a chart I did for one news story. I'm a fan of the overly simplistic data visualizations, so forgive the sort of terse nature of it, but basically, the idea behind it was is that when I was looking at this information, I visualized it to see the patterns right away, but because I knew the context, I could see the pattern, but when I communicate this information to the audience, they don't know that context. So I spent a lot of time adding, of course you need a title, right? And then you need some explanatory intro text, something to encompass or encapsulate what is the audience looking at. And then you need a hierarchy if there's multiple components. How do we create a visual hierarchy within the presentation of information, and then within each idea, we need to add annotations that explain what are the important parts, so that we can show, for example, in this case, how and when non-combatant deaths increased in Azerbaijan in the army, and then what political things happened that played a role in the change of that pattern, and so there's some reference lines with some labels that explain that, and some trend lines with an arrow that kind of show hey, this says audience, look at this, this is important. And then down below, we have a kind of a horizontally stacked bar chart showing, breaking that each category, main category, non-combatant, combatant, down into their subcategories of the cause of death for each of those. And so we can compare each one, non-combatant and combatant, side by side, but we can also take a look at the distribution of the subcategories of type of causes of death. And then you can see also, of course, we have the source of the data, which is hugely important. That oftentimes I say that goes without saying, but you have to say it, because how many charts, how many visuals, or how often do you see journalists or activists quoting data, but you never know where they got that data? That's ridiculous. If data is the grounds on which you've created an argument, or a point in your story or your reporting, you have to source it, make it easy. And today with the World Wide Web, if it's in an image and you're sharing it on Facebook, then of course put the source in the image. If it's in an article, link to the data by all means. That's what links are for. There's a lot of value in that. But in general, going back to this introduce, explain, reinforce, highlight, sequence, recommend, and inquire. Don't expect, do a lot of the work for your audience. Don't expect your audience to, take those, jump across those data obstacles themselves when you can make it a lot easier for them. That way they get the point that you're trying to make. And then if they don't agree with it, they can always take a look at the source of the data and then, take a look at that if they are so inclined and come up with counter arguments to your position or to the points that you're trying to make. That is always valid and important in public discourse. So finishing up the last section is just kind of in my experience. I've been doing this for a long time now, based in Tbilisi, Georgia, but I've been working on projects in the South Caucasus and in the former Soviet space, and over the last, I don't know, since around 2010, 11, so for about 8 years. So use common sense. I often see people that are interested in communicating data. They get lost in the details of the data and they forget that they're trying to communicate something to an audience. Take the data out and see, does what I'm writing or does what I'm visually designing make sense? If it doesn't, okay, throw it out or rewrite it or redo it. If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. No amount of pretty colors is going to change that. Show it to somebody else. Get feedback from other people. That is always useful. Going back. This is about communication in the end, and so don't do anything you wouldn't do if you were writing a traditional story, except apart from what the technology allows you to do with the data. But the rules are the same. If you're a reporter, you have to be true to the data, true to the source. You should not misrepresent that information to your audience, and you need to write clearly so that the audience can understand what you're trying to say. Mean what you say and say what you mean. There's no need to misrepresent the information, and that quite frankly is going to get you a lot of black marks among your audience and among your colleagues. It's just not a good thing to do. It's not really ethical journalism or ethical reporting. Do what you would do if you were writing a traditional story. A visualization like the one we showed before, it has a flow. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It has components. It has context. It answers the questions: the who, what, why, where, when, and how. If you do that, if you do that on even a basic level, you're doing good. And if you're doing that visually, hats off to you, because that is a good visual. That's a good visual place to be. Really learn statistics. Don't settle for books that teach you elementary math for journalists. I've seen a few of those out there. Like, hey, journalists, we know you don't like math, so here's a book of really simple math to make you a data journalist. That's. I think like if you're going to work with data, you should like data. You shouldn't be afraid of it, and you should really sit down and learn some statistics, as much as you can. And when you have questions, there are a lot of people out there that can help you learn those concepts and ideas. Learn to wrangle data. That means manipulate data, change it so that you can analyze it in different ways, or even get it into a format so you can do different visuals, like maps, for example. Learn how to use spreadsheets very well. Learn the limitations of spreadsheets, and when you reach those limitations, learn how to code. I know that's a common, word used, learn to code. There's value in it, or make a friend who knows how to code that can help you get the data you want into the format you need. Uh, Sit down and learn some graphic design. Learn Gestalt principles, learn graphic design principles, learn typography and color theory. These are all really important things to learn, and they help you when visually communicating your data, but not necessarily in prose. Um, uh, I would say, like, don't settle though for an Excel chart. Again, if we go back to this idea of highlighting and recommending and annotating, an Excel chart is not a very good final product for all of these things. You're going to want to take it few steps further. The Excel chart is, we would call that the beginning. Once you have that, then you can take it a little bit further. Read a lot of things written in data. Read data blogs. Read critically. Be curious and ask questions of that data. Does it make sense? Do the averages make sense? Does the methodology make sense? Is the data collected, um, in a with a good methodology? Join online communities that are also involved in these things. Follow people that are online doing really cool things like Mike Bostock or oh gosh, there's so many. Follow Alberto Cairo on his social media accounts. It's funny. There's a lot of good laughs. You get involved. You can respond and talk to these people that are, really kind of teachers at the forefront of these areas. Um, Never underestimate a good bar chart. Love the bar chart. Don't underestimate it. There's value in it. People can understand it. It communicates very well. Don't avoid it because it's tried and true. Use it when you need to, and be curious. If you're working with data, you have to be curious. If you're not curious, you're not going to ask the important questions. You're not going to create the story. And you're not going to create a good visual or written story that is going to communicate well and clarify. You're gonna leave a lot of context out because you're not asking the right questions. So being curious is crucial. I think that's it. It's already 3 o'clock. It's been about an hour. If you have, I hope this was informative. This was a very sort of overview of each of those topics. You can, of course, dive in more and more. And if you're curious about any of those topics or more, how to learn more, I'd be happy to respond to your questions at my email address, which is on the last slide of this slideshow. So this is my first webinar. I hope it was of value, and I hope I hope you were able to take something away from it. All right, thank you. Bye bye.